Chapter 4. The Lock-In. Maya swore she wasn't going to text him. She'd spent the entire day after the bar pacing her apartment, her phone burning a hole in her pocket, his number, a reckless impulse she'd gotten from the bar's receipt where he'd scrawled it, mocking her from the counter. She was better than this, stronger than this. She didn't chase men, especially not ones who looked like they'd break your heart and your bed frame in the same night. But his voice, that low, gravelly drawl, kept echoing in her head, and the memory of his rain-soaked grin made her thighs clench every time she closed her eyes. She lasted 24 hours. It wasn't even a proper text, just a photo of that damn apple from the grocery store, still sitting on her counter like a taunt with one word: sweet. She hit send before she could overthink it, her heart pounding like she'd just run a mile. His reply came in under 5 minutes, buzzing her phone like a live wire. "Not as sweet as you think, darlin'." Her pulse spiked, heat flooding her chest. She stared at the screen, her fingers hovering, typing and erasing half a dozen responses before settling on, "You always this cryptic?" His answer was immediate. "You always this curious?" She didn't reply. She couldn't. The words felt too much like an admission, like she was handing him another piece of herself without meaning to. Instead, she tossed her phone on the couch and tried to drown him out with a glass of wine and a shitty reality show. It didn't work. 2 nights later, she saw him again. It wasn't the coffee shop or the bar this time. It was the parking lot of her own damn apartment complex, a coincidence so absurd it felt like the universe was laughing at her. The rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy and humid, the asphalt glistening under the sodium glow of the streetlights. He was leaning against the open hood of a beat-up black pickup truck, his sleeves rolled up, hands slick with motor oil, a wrench glinting in his grip. The sight of him, muscles flexing under his tight t-shirt, a smear of grease on his forearm, his hair falling into his eyes, made her mouth go dry. He looked up as she approached, her heels clicking on the pavement, and that fucking grin spread across his face, slow and dangerous, like he'd been waiting for her all along. "Of course," he said, his voice carrying that same rough edge that had been haunting her dreams. "Of course what?" she shot back, clutching her purse like it could shield her from the way her body was already reacting, heart racing, skin tingling, a low ache starting to pulse between her legs. He straightened, wiping his hands on a rag, his eyes never leaving hers. "That you'd show up right when I needed someone to hold the flashlight," she snorted, trying to sound unimpressed. "I didn't say I'd help." He tilted his head, his grin sharpening. "You will." That quiet certainty, that infuriating confidence, hit her like a spark to kindling. It was the same tone he'd used in the coffee shop, the grocery store, the bar, like he already knew how this was going to play out, like he could see every thought she was trying to hide. It pissed her off as much as it turned her on. Against every shred of common sense, she found herself stepping closer, her sneakers scuffing the wet pavement. "You're awfully sure of yourself," she said, crossing her arms, trying to keep some distance between them. He chuckled, low and dirty, the sound vibrating through her. "Not myself, you." Minutes later, she was crouched next to him, holding a flashlight while he worked on the truck's engine, the beam cutting through the dim parking lot. The air was thick with the smell of oil, rain, and him, that heady mix of leather, sweat, and something darker, something that made her think of tangled sheets and rough hands. His arm brushed hers as he reached for a bolt, leaving a streak of warmth that lingered too long, and she had to bite her lip to keep from reacting. Every move he made was slow, methodical, like he was savoring the moment, like he knew exactly what he was doing to her. "You always this bossy?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt, the flashlight beam wavering slightly in her grip. He glanced at her, his eyes glinting in the dark, a smear of grease on his cheek that somehow made him look even hotter. "You always this obedient?" Her breath caught, sharp and betraying, and she saw the way his lips twitched, like he'd caught her red-handed. "Fuck you," she muttered, but there was no heat in it, just a flush creeping up her neck. He laughed, a low, rumbling sound that made her stomach flip. "Careful, sweetheart. Keep talking like that, and I might take it as an invitation." She should have walked away right then, should have handed him the flashlight and gone back to her apartment, where she could lock the door and pretend she wasn't burning up inside. But she didn't. She stayed, her knees brushing the rough pavement, her pulse hammering as he worked in silence, the tension between them building like a storm. When he finally stood, tossing the wrench into a toolbox with a clatter, he wiped his hands on the rag, his movements slow and deliberate. "You should come inside," he said, nodding toward her apartment building, his voice low, not a question but a statement, like he already knew her answer. Her heart stopped, then started again, too fast. She should have said no, should have made some excuse, laundry, work, anything, but the words stuck in her throat, and all she could feel was the heat of his gaze, the way it stripped her bare without a single touch. She stood, brushing off her jeans, trying to ignore the way her hands trembled. "You're pretty bold for a guy who's been stalking me across town," she said, aiming for sharp but landing somewhere closer to breathless. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the oil on his hands, the faint musk of his skin. "You're not a stranger anymore," he said, his voice rough, his eyes locked on hers. "And you didn't say no?" Inside, her apartment felt too small, too quiet, the air thick with the weight of what she'd just done. Let him in, let him cross that line. She kicked off her shoes, her bare feet cold against the hardwood, her heart pounding so loud she was sure he could hear it. He walked in like he'd been there 1,000 times, his boots leaving faint smudges of dirt on her clean floor, his presence filling the space like smoke. He didn't bother looking around, didn't comment on the neat stack of books on her coffee table or the half-empty wine glass on the counter. His eyes were on her, only her, slow and deliberate, like he was peeling back every layer she'd spent years building. "You always let strangers in?" he asked, his voice low, teasing, but with an edge that made her skin hum. She met his gaze, refusing to back down. "You're not a stranger," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them, heavy with meaning she hadn't intended to give him. That grin again, slow, dangerous, like she'd just handed him a loaded gun. Good. He didn't touch her, not yet, but he didn't need to. His gaze was a physical thing, sliding over her like a touch, lingering on her lips, her throat, the curve of her hips under her jeans. It felt like being unwrapped, like he was stripping away every excuse, every defense, until there was nothing left but raw want. "Why are you looking at me like that?" she asked, her voice softer than she meant, almost a whisper, betraying the heat pooling low in her belly. He stepped closer, his boots scuffing the floor, his body close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him. "Because you like it," he said, his voice a low growl, certain and unapologetic. "And because I'm thinking about all the ways I could make you like it more." Her breath hitched, her body betraying her with a shiver she couldn't hide. God help her, she did like it. The way he saw her, the way he pushed her, the way he made her feel like she was standing on the edge of something dangerous and thrilling. The air between them was a live wire, humming with everything unsaid, every possibility she'd been too afraid to want. He stepped closer still, so close she could see the faint pulse at the base of his throat, could smell the oil and sweat and him. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice quiet but rough, like he was daring her to push him away, daring her to lie. She opened her mouth, her lips parting, but no words came out. Her body was screaming, wanting him closer, wanting him to touch her, to cross that final line. But her brain was still fighting, clinging to the last shred of control. He waited, his eyes locked on hers, patient but unrelenting, like he knew she was already his. And when she stayed silent, when she didn't tell him to stop, his grin softened into something darker, hungrier. That was answer enough. Chapter 5. The Break. The rain outside was a relentless drumbeat, hammering against the windows of Maya's apartment, filling the air with a low, steady roar. But it wasn't enough to drown out the pounding of her heart, the way it thundered in her chest like she was 16 and sneaking out for the first time. He stood too close, close enough that she could feel the heat rolling off him, could smell the heady mix of rain, motor oil, and that dark, primal scent that was unmistakably him. It was intoxicating, like leather and sin, and it made her want to do things she hadn't let herself want in years. "Still not telling me to stop?" he asked, his voice a low, rough growl that vibrated through her, settling deep in her core. Her breath came out shaky, betraying her before she could even speak. "Do you want me to?" She tried to sound defiant, but the words came out softer, needier, like she was already giving in. His smile was slow, deliberate, predatory, like a hunter who'd finally cornered something that had been running too long. "No," he said, taking a step closer, his boots scuffing the hardwood floor. "I don't." Her back hit the kitchen counter, the cool marble biting into her hips through her jeans. She hadn't even realized she'd been retreating, her body moving on instinct until she was trapped, caged between the counter and the solid wall of him. He didn't touch her, not yet, but his presence was a physical force, pressing against her, making her skin hum with anticipation. Her pulse was a traitor, thudding so hard she could feel it in her throat, her wrists, between her thighs. "You're enjoying this?" he said, his voice laced with amusement, but his eyes were dark, hungry, like he could see every filthy thought she was trying to hide. "Enjoying what?" she shot back, trying to claw back some control, but her voice was too breathy, too raw. He tilted his head, his gaze sliding over her like a touch, lingering on her lips, her throat, the way her chest rose and fell too fast under her thin sweater. "The way I'm making you wait," he said, his voice dropping lower, rougher, like he was savoring every second of her unraveling. "The way you're trying so fucking hard to pretend you don't want this." Her cheeks flushed, heat crawling up her neck, and she hated how right he was, hated that he could see the way her body was betraying her, the way her nipples tightened under her sweater, the way her thighs pressed together like she could stop the ache building there. "You're insufferable," she muttered, but there was no bite in it, just a desperate attempt to keep her walls up. He grinned, that slow, dangerous smile that made her feel like prey. "And you fucking like it." Then he moved, slow, deliberate, like he had all the time in the world to unravel her. His hand came up, not to touch her, but to rest against the counter beside her, his arm a solid barrier that caged her in. The motion brought him closer, close enough that she could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the scar through his eyebrow, the way his lips curved like they were made for whispering filthy promises. Her pulse jumped, her body leaning toward him without her permission, drawn to him like gravity. "Say it," he said, his voice quiet but commanding, like he was giving her one last chance to back out. "Say what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes locked on his, unable to look away. He leaned in, just a fraction, his breath warm against her cheek. "That you want me to stay?" Her chest heaved, her breaths coming too fast, too shallow. She wanted to look away, to hide the way her body was screaming for him, but his gaze held her pinned, stripping away every layer of control she'd spent years building. Her lips parted, her voice cracking as she tried to speak. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, and tried again. Stay. The smile that curved his mouth was dangerous, satisfied, like he'd just won a game she hadn't realized they were playing. "Good girl," he said, his voice soft but heavy with intent, the words sinking into her like a brand. Her knees nearly buckled, a rush of heat flooding her core, her panties growing damp from just those two fucking words. She hated how much she wanted to hear them again, how much she wanted him to say worse, dirtier things. He didn't kiss her, not yet, but he didn't need to. His presence was enough. The heat of him, the way his eyes roamed her face like he was memorizing every detail, every reaction. "You feel that?" he asked, his voice almost a growl now, low and rough, vibrating through her like a current. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling, her body screaming for him to close the distance, to do something, anything, to ease the ache that was threatening to consume her. "That's what happens when you stop pretending," he said, his tone dark, knowing, like he could see every filthy fantasy she'd ever had and was daring her to admit them. And then, finally, he touched her, just his fingertips grazing her jaw, slow and deliberate, the calloused pads of his fingers rough against her skin. The contact was electric, sending a jolt through her that made her breath hitch, her body arching slightly toward him. He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering, his fingers brushing the sensitive skin just below her earlobe. It was such a small gesture, barely anything at all, but it felt like he'd set her on fire, every nerve ending alight with want. He leaned in, his lips brushing her temple, not a kiss, not quite, just a whisper of contact that left her skin burning, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. "Next time," he murmured, his voice so soft she almost didn't hear it, "I won't stop." Then he stepped back, the sudden absence of his heat like a slap. She stood there, breathless, trembling, every part of her screaming for him to come back, to finish what he'd started. Her hands gripped the counter behind her, her knuckles white, her body aching with a need she hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. He didn't say another word, just gave her one last look, dark, hungry, promising, before turning and walking out, the door clicking shut behind him. The rain kept falling, but it couldn't wash away the fire he'd left burning inside her. She was fucked, and she knew it. Chapter 6. The Fall. Maya didn't sleep that night. Her apartment, usually a sanctuary of order, felt like a cage, the walls pressing in as she paced the hardwood floor. Every word he'd spoken, every look he'd given her, every fleeting brush of his fingers played on a loop in her mind, relentless and maddening. The memory of his lips grazing her temple, the low promise of "next time I won't stop," had left her wired, her body humming with a need she couldn't ignore. She'd tried to distract herself, showering, scrolling her phone, pouring a glass of wine she barely touched, but nothing worked. Her skin felt too tight, her thoughts too loud, and by the time morning came, she was no closer to steady than she'd been when he walked out her door. That evening, when a sharp knock echoed through her apartment, her heart lurched into her throat. She didn't need to check the peephole to know it was him. Her pulse knew, her body knew, and the ache between her thighs fucking knew. She stood frozen for a moment, her hand hovering over the doorknob, trying to summon the strength to send him away. But who was she kidding? She'd been waiting for this since the moment she saw him leaning against that coffee shop wall. She opened the door, and there he was, hands shoved in the pockets of his worn leather jacket, that infuriating grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. His dark hair was slightly mussed, like he'd run his fingers through it, and his eyes, those sharp, predatory eyes, locked onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You gonna make me stand out here all night, sweetheart?" he drawled, his voice low and rough, dripping with that same cocky assurance that drove her insane. She didn't answer, didn't trust her voice not to betray her. She just stepped aside, letting him in, the door clicking shut behind him like the sound of a guillotine falling. The air shifted the moment they were alone, the small space of her apartment suddenly too hot, too close. He didn't speak right away, just stood there, his gaze raking over her, slow, unblinking, deliberate, like he was peeling back every layer she'd ever built to hide behind. Her pulse was a traitor, hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it, could see the way her chest rose and fell too fast under her thin black tank top. She hadn't dressed for him, hadn't planned for this, but the way his eyes lingered on the curve of her collarbone, the bare skin of her shoulders, made her feel like she was standing there naked. "You told me to stay," he said finally, his voice low, rough, like he was pulling the words from somewhere deep. "Last night, in your kitchen." Maya nodded, her throat too tight to speak, her mouth dry despite the sip of wine she'd taken earlier to calm her nerves. She could still feel the ghost of his fingers on her jaw, the heat of his breath against her temple. He took a step closer, his boots heavy on the floor, his eyes never leaving hers. "Still mean it?" Her heart slammed against her ribs, her body screaming yes, even as her brain tried to hold on to the last shred of control. "Yes," she said, the word slipping out soft but certain, like a confession she hadn't meant to make. That one word seemed to snap something in him, like a chain breaking loose. He crossed the room in 2 slow, deliberate steps, and then his hand was on her jaw, tilting her face up to his. His touch was firm, possessive, his calloused fingers rough against her skin, sending a jolt through her that settled low in her belly. The first kiss wasn't soft, it was raw, claiming, impatient, like he'd been holding himself back for too fucking long. His lips were hot, demanding, tasting faintly of whiskey and rain, and she melted into it, her fingers curling into the leather of his jacket, pulling him closer without thinking. He groaned into her mouth, a low, guttural sound that made her thighs clench, and his other hand found the small of her back, pressing her against him until she could feel the hard line of his body, the evidence of how much he wanted her. The world outside vanished, the rain, the city, her own damn name, none of it mattered. All she could feel was the scrape of his stubble against her cheek, the heat of his palm sliding under her tank top, the way her pulse pounded in her ears, drowning out everything else. He broke the kiss just long enough to look at her, his thumb brushing her swollen lower lip, his eyes dark and hungry. "You have no fucking idea how long I've been waiting for you to say that," he murmured, his voice rough, almost a growl, sending a shiver down her spine. "Then stop waiting," she whispered, the words bold and reckless, her body arching toward him like it had a mind of its own. That was all it took. The rest was a blur of heat and motion, his jacket hitting the floor with a heavy thud, her back finding the wall as he pressed himself against her, the sound of her own breath catching as his mouth trailed along her neck, hot and deliberate. His teeth grazed her pulse point, just hard enough to make her gasp, and his hands were everywhere, sliding under her tank top, gripping her hips, tugging at the waistband of her jeans like he couldn't get her naked fast enough. Every touch was deliberate, every pause calculated to make her ache, to push her closer to the edge without letting her fall. "Fuck, you're gorgeous," he muttered against her skin, his voice thick with want as he tugged her tank top over her head, tossing it somewhere behind him. His hands found her breasts, his thumbs brushing over her nipples through the thin lace of her bra, and she arched into him, a soft moan escaping her lips before she could stop it. He grinned against her throat, clearly pleased with himself. "That's it, sweetheart. Let me hear you." She should have been embarrassed, should have tried to hold on to some semblance of control, but she was too far gone, too caught up in the heat of him, the way his hands knew exactly where to touch, where to linger. He slowed things down when she wanted them faster, his fingers teasing the edge of her jeans, dipping just below the waistband, making her squirm against the wall. It wasn't just physical, it was a game, a storm, a breaking point she'd been hurtling toward since the moment she saw him leaning against that coffee shop wall. He unbuttoned her jeans with one hand, his other still braced against the wall beside her head, his eyes locked on hers as he slid the denim down her hips. "Tell me what you want," he said, his voice low and commanding, his fingers brushing the damp lace of her panties, making her hips buck involuntarily. "You," she gasped, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer. "I want you." That was all he needed. He kissed her again, harder this time, his tongue claiming her mouth as his hand slipped inside her panties, his fingers finding her slick and ready. She moaned into his mouth, her nails digging into his shoulders, and he growled in response, his touch relentless, pushing her higher, faster, until she was trembling, her body on the verge of shattering. When it finally came, when there was no space left between them, no more waiting to be done, it was like falling off a cliff she'd been teetering on for weeks. His hands, his mouth, his body moving against hers, it was raw, overwhelming, a collision of need and surrender. She came undone under his touch, her breath hitching, her body shaking, his name on her lips like a prayer she hadn't meant to say. And afterward, as they lay tangled together on her couch, her skin still buzzing, her heart still racing, she realized the worst part, the part that made her breathless even now, was knowing this was just the beginning. He wasn't done with her, and she wasn't done with him, not by a long shot.